HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Life in Ancient Rome by Lionel Casson, read by John Glouchevitch. Preface. This book presents a series of concise sketches of key phases of life in the Roman world during its greatest period, the peaceful and prosperous years of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. What life was like in the city, in the countryside, on the road, what it was like in the various levels of society, from the slave to the aristocrat, from the soldier in the ranks to his commander-in-chief, the emperor, what gods people put their faith in, what amusements beguiled them. The sketches are fashioned to reveal how the inevitable cycle played out in the circumstances of this very special age. When sums of Roman money are quoted, they have alongside them an amount in dollars to give some idea of the equivalent purchasing power. These amounts are by no means to be taken as exact. Converting ancient values into modern is highly speculative. What I offer are little more than guesses based on the handful of useful indications of ancient wages and commodity prices that have survived. I am fairly certain, however, that they do not overestimate, although they may underestimate. 1. The times. In the 2nd century of the Christian era, the Empire of Rome comprehended the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. The frontiers of that extensive monarchy were guaranteed by ancient renown and disciplined valor. The gentle but powerful influence of laws and manners had gradually cemented the union of the provinces. Their peaceful inhabitants enjoyed and abused the advantages of wealth and luxury. During a happy period of more than 80 years, the public administration was conducted by the virtue and abilities of Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the 2 Antonines. These are the words with which Edward Gibbon opens his monumental history. They paint a picture of material well-being whose colors, though perhaps too bright, are not false. It indeed was an age of peace and prosperity, thanks to the honesty and efficiency of Rome's government, the extent of its sway, and the strength of the armies with which it defended all it held. The Mediterranean, most of what is today France, Spain, Belgium, Holland, the Balkan countries, even the better part of the British Isles, was one world politically, all under the rule of the Roman Empire. Any inhabitant could make his way from the burning sun of Mesopotamia to the mists of Scotland without crossing a national frontier. The founder of this vast realm, the man who welded it together, fashioned its machinery of government, and launched it on its incredibly long career, was Augustus, the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. Augustus rode to power on the waves of bloody civil war, a series of large-scale, bitter conflicts in which he first destroyed his great-uncle's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and then his own partner in this success, Mark Antony. When, in 30 BC, the latter fell on his sword and his celebrated supporter pressed an asp to her bosom, Augustus was left in sole command of the Roman world. From the arts of war, he turned, with equal ability, to the arts of peace. And since fate kindly granted him almost half a century more of life, until AD 14 he was able to get the new arrangements he devised for governing Rome working smoothly and surely. What he created was, basically, an autocracy, but one that functioned behind the facade of a republic. From roughly 500 BC to 50 BC, when Julius Caesar, in effect, brought it to an end, Rome had been a republic. Its chief legislative body was a Senate, whose membership, though theoretically open to all, tended to be mostly drawn from the aristocracy. Its chief executive, a pair of annually elected consuls. Under Augustus, the consuls and other magistrates of the Republic continued to hold office, the Senate to sit regularly and deliberate and pass motions. But the reins of power, no doubt about it, were in Augustus's grasp. It was he who controlled the army and navy, who determined foreign and domestic policy, whose favor made or broke political careers, who appointed the administrators to run Rome's provinces, as the overseas possessions were called, who, above all, stood for the government in the eyes of both citizens and subjects. His face appeared on the coins they handled, his name was prominent on public buildings and monuments, and in all major communities there were temples where he, or his genius, his spirit, was worshipped. He was an emperor in all but name. He discreetly insisted on being called by the informal title princeps, a neutral term that meant only first citizen. Augustus did his work so well that those who followed him on the throne, Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Vespasian, and on through the great emperors of the 2nd century A.D., whom Gibbon singled out for mention, merely adjusted or adapted, but never basically changed what he had wrought. Obviously, there was no place in the system for freedom of speech or similar precious political rights that autocracy cannot countenance. On the other hand, infinitely more people enjoyed social and economic freedom than ever had under the Republic. Moreover, Rome was, by and large, lucky in the quality of the rulers that came to the throne. Augustus's successors for the next 200 years were all men of ability and, with a few exceptions, men of integrity. Even the few exceptions caused no fatal damage, since the governmental machinery continued to work in spite of them. A Caligula could spread terror in the capital with his insanities, or a Nero helpless exasperation with his inanities, but the bureaucracy they headed went right ahead doing its job, collecting taxes, administering justice, carrying on the imperial correspondence, paying the imperial salaries, attending, in short, to the day-to-day needs of the state. The key to the emperor's power, and to the peace enjoyed by the diverse peoples he ruled, was Rome's efficient armed forces. Before Augustus, Roman armies and navies had been called up as needed. Augustus created a standing army and navy, with himself as commander-in-chief. This was a potentially dangerous instrument, and the time would come when the imperial armies made rather than obeyed emperors. But that lay far in the future. The rulers of the first 2 centuries A.D. used the armed forces with care and intelligence, the army to conquer and guard, the navy to keep the sea lanes free of pirates. The emperors lived in great palaces that they built for themselves on Rome's Palatine Hill. These included not only their living quarters, but the grandiose halls where they held court and the offices where their bureaucracy carried on the daily routine of government. Italy enjoyed a privileged status as Rome's historic heartland and the source of the superb soldiers that had enabled it to conquer the Mediterranean world. But Rome's strength now lay in its provinces. From these it drew the major portions of its wealth, brains, and muscle. The grain and wine and oil that fed its armies and civil servants came from Egypt and France and Spain. The businessmen who maintained its active commerce were largely provincials. And the army, though its core was still Italian, was increasingly recruited from the provinces, while provincials officered as well as manned the navy. By the 2nd century A.D., the emperors themselves came from the provinces. Trajan and Hadrian were both of Spanish extraction. The head of state had to be as concerned for the political and economic health of Gauls, Arabs, Egyptians, and so on, as of Romans or Italians. When an ambitious provincial governor forwarded to Tiberius more in taxes than the stipulated amount, the emperor snapped that he wanted his sheep sheared, not skinned. To administer the overseas territories so vital to the empire, Augustus and his successors sought men of ability whom they could trust. They had to turn to the members of the Senate, even though few of these nourished warm feelings toward the rulers who had usurped their power. The emperors, as soon as they were able, widened their net to entice talented men into government wherever they could find them. They drew upon well-established, prosperous families that had previously stayed out of politics, upon provincials, even upon ex-slaves. In the process, they made government service a ready way for men of intelligence and ambition to climb up the social and political ladder. But it was not only the man near the top who found paths for advancement open to him. They lay open for the whole of society, little people as well as big. This was because of Rome's unique attitude towards citizenship, its willingness to share it with others. In ancient Athens, only the children of Athenian parents were citizens. For a foreigner to gain the privilege took nothing less than an act of the Athenian Congress. Other ancient states were scarcely more charitable. Rome was an outstanding exception. From its very beginnings, it adopted the practice of incorporating into the state some of the communities it conquered by granting them citizenship en bloc. What the Republic had started, the emperors continued on an increased scale, turning by decree the populace of entire cities, even groups of cities, into Roman citizens overnight. Claudius was particularly generous in this regard. One wag grumbled that he had put every Greek, Gaul, Spaniard, and Briton into togas. Citizenship, of course, brought with it the full protection of Rome's authority and law. The best-known instance is St. Paul's refusal to be judged by a provincial governor. Though a native of Tarsus in Southeast Asia Minor, he was a Roman citizen and demanded, as was his right, to be tried in Rome. How he became a citizen is a question. Tarsus may have been enfranchised en masse, perhaps by Julius Caesar, in return for the help its people gave him during his fight to the death with Pompey. And, just as important, citizenship brought a man new social and economic opportunities, the possibility of entering and moving up in Rome's governmental apparatus. So we find people of provincial extraction, Greeks or Arabs or Levantines, or any of the other many nationalities within Rome's bounds, mounting the ladder to administer its provinces, command its armies, even sit on its throne. Enfranchisement of communities was only one of the large-scale ways in which Rome extended its citizenship. Another was through the manumission of slaves. Roman law had the incredibly liberal provision that the slave of a Roman citizen, upon being freed, became a citizen himself. Since the Romans commonly did free their slaves, multitudes of new members of the most varied origins each year joined the citizen body. Moreover, for whoever had the ambition, there were any number of ways of becoming a citizen, by joining the army or the navy, or by serving as a local magistrate in one's hometown. By the beginning of the 3rd century AD, practically all of the population of the empire had in one way or another gained citizenship. The ruling class was no longer Roman, not even Italian, but a melange of men from all the provinces. Rome's empire lasted far longer than any other in history, half a millennium in the West and a millennium and a half in the East. Unquestionably, one of the factors that held it together so successfully for so many years was the generous spread of the citizenship. Men who were born in the mountains of Spain or on the shores of Syria came to feel themselves as Roman as those born along the Tiber. There were also strong economic ties to add their holding power. Augustus recognized that efficient rule over a large area required swift and easy movement of dispatches and troops. And so he and his successors embarked on a program that laced the empire together with a superb network of roads. At the same time, the Navy finally freed the Mediterranean from its age-old curse of piracy and permitted ships to shuttle securely along its sea lanes. All this quickened economic life enormously. Towns now had easier access by roads to local markets, and new access by road and ship to markets all over the empire. Soldiers wore armor of Austrian iron or of Spanish copper, alloyed with British tin. Wealthy men had themselves buried in coffins of Greek or Asia Minor marble. Italians drank wine from France and ate bread made of Egyptian grain. Altars all over smoked with incense from Arabia or Ethiopia. More people than ever before were in a position to make money as importers, exporters, ship owners, brokers, teamsters, and the myriad other activities needed by a vigorous and multifarious trade. Every center of consequence now boasted a comfortable middle class, and wealth spread far wider than in previous ages. There was still an abyss between the very rich and the very poor. There were still throngs mired in desperate poverty. But previously, few had been able to find an escape, and now thousands did, and remained forever grateful to the government that had given them their chance. The city of Rome was the nerve center of this great and prosperous realm. Under the emperors, its population was perhaps as much as 1 million, a gigantic metropolis. After centuries of receiving immigrants and manumitted slaves into its midst, it had become almost totally polyglot. By the 2nd century AD, perhaps 90% of its denizens were of foreign extraction. Into its port came the products of Europe, Africa, Asia. In its public places stood buildings that only the rulers of an immensely wealthy state could afford to erect. Its streets were thronged with men of all classes, with lofty officials and government slaves, with millionaire ship owners and bankers, and a mass of chronic unemployed who lived off government handouts. It was the capital of a state that for the first time had made one unified political whole of the Mediterranean, that boasted a society more open than any before the 19th century, and a prosperity unmatched until the 20th, and that gave Western civilization the longest period of peace it was ever to know. Let us look at the various facets of life in this great capital during its finest hour, the 2nd century AD, the years that Gibbon lauded as a veritable golden age. We will have several helpful guides to show us about. Pliny the Younger, an eminently proper nobleman who left behind a collection of letters to his circle of eminently proper friends; Petronius, a most improper nobleman who wrote the Satyricon, the justly celebrated novel about the doings of a trio of scoundrels among the nouveaux riches; and Martial and Juvenal, masters of poetic satire who looked, the one with amused scorn and the other with sardonic rage, on the urban scene about them. 2. The family. Throughout the whole of Rome's history, one feature remained constant: the family. The city grew to be an empire, the republic became an autocracy, old-fashioned religion yielded to frenetic new cults from the East, but through it all, Roman society was based on the family, economic life was built around it, and its many complex problems continued to provide endless matter for debate among Roman lawyers. At the head of every Roman family was the paterfamilias, father of the family, the oldest male member. He was undisputed lord and master, even with the power of life and death over his sons and daughters, a right that, primitive though it may seem, took a long time to become a dead letter. There were cases on record of it being exercised as late as the 1st century BC, though happily not after that. Another equally extraordinary right he never lost. Until the day he died, he was the sole owner of the family property. Sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, none could legally have possessions of their own so long as they were in the power of a paterfamilias. It was all his, even the salary of, say, a grown-up son with a lucrative government post, or a legacy that might have come to a middle-aged daughter from a friend. One would expect to hear of the younger generation exploding in exasperation at such an impossible state of affairs, but apparently it did not. Almost certainly, some accommodation must have been worked out, though we have no idea what it was. One factor helped: that life expectancy was short, that only the exception lived to a ripe old age. Thus, in the normal course of events, most children did not remain too long in this anomalous position of being adult in years, yet minor by law. In one sense, a paterfamilias never did lose his power of life and death. When a child was born, he alone, not necessarily in consultation with the mother, determined whether it was to live or be exposed to die. Infanticide was practiced throughout ancient times among poor and rich, the poor to limit the number of mouths they had to feed, the rich the number of heirs who would divide up a handsome property. And when the children were grown up, inevitably the paterfamilias arranged marriages for them. Legally, he could only insist that they take a mate and not specify whom. But since the girls were married off when barely into their teens, and the boys had no money they could call their own, it is hardly likely that either had much choice. Girls married when they were 12 to 15, boys when slightly older. Marriages were arranged to carry on a family's name and preserve its property. Passion and romance played no part. Men who needed extramarital relations went to whores, or if they had the money, elegant courtesans. We hear many lurid tales about adultery, orgies, and depraved carryings-on, but this all took place among the upper crust, the Roman nightclub crowd. Marriage among responsible Romans was a serious matter, knit by a firm emotional bond. There was, of course, a legal bond, but no religious one. No church blessed a Roman union. Consequently, to cohabit with a woman without being formally married was not living in sin, but a recognized procedure. Even emperors did it. Marcus Aurelius, for example, the philosopher-emperor who ruled Rome from AD 161 to 180, when his wife died, took the daughter of his wife's business agent as concubine rather than wife, so as not to introduce a stepmother over all the children. It was not unusual for an upper-class woman to set up a household with a maid of humble status, even a slave. It might start tongues wagging, but there was nothing irregular about it. In arranging a marriage, the first topic the paterfamilias turned to was the dowry. Every bride had to supply one, but it always remained hers. If her husband died, or if the couple divorced, the dowry was returned, minus a fraction for the upkeep of the children and possibly another fraction as penalty if she had misbehaved. Since women married so early, their chance of being widowed was great. Without a dowry, there could have been no possibility whatsoever of finding a new husband. Once the dowry and lesser matters had been settled, the families arranged a betrothal, a ceremony in which the prospective bridegroom not only made his pledge, but sealed it with gifts, most often a ring that was worn on the very same finger we use today. Ancient savants claimed that there was a special nerve running from the ring finger to the heart. Theoretically, a formal wedding was not necessary, merely a matter of tradition, but a Roman bride wanted it as much as her modern counterpart. In picking the day, one had to be very careful to avoid any of the considerable number that were of evil omen. All of May was out, and so was the first half of June, although the second half was favored. When the day came, the bride was dressed in a special gown, a full-length white wool tunic that had been woven on an old-fashioned loom, and donned a large orange or yellow veil. The house was decorated with flowers and boughs of evergreen. A sacrifice might be carried out. It was not obligatory. The marriage contract was signed before 10 witnesses, the couple joined hands to mark the cementing of the union, and everybody sat down to the wedding feast. The Roman satirist Juvenal sums it up with his usual brevity. The contract signed, all shout best wishes and take their seats for a huge repast. Toward evening, a procession conducted the bride to her new home. 4 boys whose parents were still alive accompanied her, one lighting the way with a torch of a special thorn bush, 2 by her side, the 4th carrying her spinning apparatus. All walked, caroling wedding songs, to the doorway, where the bride put fillets of wool on the doorposts and anointed them with oil. She was then lifted over the threshold and saluted her husband with the touching age-old phrase, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gai. Where you are, John, there I, Mary. However, Gaius and Guy did not have to be with each other very long if they did not care to. Divorce among the Romans was simple and quick. Either party merely uttered to the other the laconic Latin phrase, tuas res tibi habero, keep what's yours for yourself, and the union was severed. Whatever children there were, being in the power of the paterfamilias, remained with the father. The dowry was returned, though this might take some time if, as frequently happened, the husband was short of cash. Cicero's letters show us both sides. While frantically trying to pay off Terentia, his wife of 30 years, whom he had divorced to marry a young woman with a fortune, he was equally frenetically trying to collect his daughter Tullia's dowry from her spendthrift ex-husband. From the moment a bride crossed the threshold of her husband's home, she was a matrona, a married woman, who would from then on dress with proper restraint and take care of running the household. What this involved depended on the family's social status. If it was low, she would move into a slum apartment. In Rome, all but the very rich lived in apartment houses, where her daily routine must have been much like that of the wife in a tenement-dwelling family of today. If she was middle class, she still moved into an apartment, although one with a space to accommodate a maid, a cook, and perhaps other household slaves. If she was of the aristocracy, she moved into a mansion that most likely housed not only her husband, but many of his family, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and numbers of the family freedmen, that is, the slaves who had been granted their liberty, yet, as was often the case, continued to live with their erstwhile master. In such an establishment, there would be a veritable army of household slaves. And whatever class she belonged to, she had the responsibility of the children, if there were any. One of the distinctive features of family life in this age was the practice of some sort of birth control, at least among the upper classes. In the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., there was an abnormal rate of childlessness among Roman families, particularly the well-to-do. Augustus, his eye on every phase of his subjects' existence, even tried to rectify the situation by law. He used both the carrot and the stick, special privileges for women with 3 or more children. For example, they had the right to act legally for themselves instead of having to go through a male guardian. Special penalties for bachelors and childless couples. For example, they could not be named as heirs in a will. One cause, certainly, was the predilection on the part of many upper-class males for homosexual relations. A more serious cause was a deliberate effort on the part of the women to avoid childbearing. How they did it is a question. Both abortion and contraception were known, but there is no way of telling to what extent they were practiced. Abortion was, at the very least, painful and could be dangerous. Contraception was preferable, but, though the medical writings of the period mention perfectly good devices, for example, inserting olive oil or honey or other clogging fluids in the vagina or using pessaries of wool, they often prescribe them along with others that are so totally absurd. One doctor, for example, endorses as very effective the wearing of the liver of a cat in a tube on the left foot, that it is doubtful how much useful knowledge circulated among ordinary married Roman couples. The courtesans the poets are always mooning about, who played the role in Roman life that geisha have in Japanese, must have had their techniques, and what they knew may have filtered back, by way of philandering husbands, to Roman society women. Possibly women insisted on their husbands and lovers practicing coitus interruptus, one of the simplest forms of contraception, but there is no mention of it in any of the contemporary medical writings or any other writings, so we have no way of being sure. Whatever the techniques, one byproduct was a welter of wealthy people with no children to inherit their riches. This inevitably brought into being a swarm of fortune hunters who fawned on childless couples, dogged the steps of bachelors and widowers, and chased after widows and spinsters. Whatever abortion or contraception was practiced was almost certainly limited to the rich. On the other hand, all classes, but particularly the poor, resorted to exposure for getting rid of unwanted children. It did not necessarily mean the child's death. Some of the most famous tales of ancient literature, such as the story of Oedipus or of Romulus and Remus, concern infants who were exposed and then rescued in the nick of time, and there are even a few important historical figures who started life this way. As a matter of fact, people found it profitable to be on the lookout for foundlings in order to raise them as slaves, either for their own household or for sale. In Roman Egypt, and very likely elsewhere as well, they scavenged for them in the town dump, where it was the practice to abandon infants. In legal documents, slaves are frequently designated as being from the dump. Sometimes they did not have to rely on the haphazardness of the dump. There were poverty-stricken families willing, despite laws against it, to sell unwanted children into slavery. Both the government and private individuals tried to alleviate the situation by instituting child assistance programs. The Emperor Nerva, followed by Trajan, established funds in various localities, the proceeds of which were to pay for the upkeep of a given number of boys and girls, many more boys than girls, since the emperors had in mind the needs of their armed forces. Private philanthropists who set up foundations happily avoided any such discrimination. Here, for example, is a provision in the will of a certain wealthy woman of Terracina, a town on the coast of Italy about midway between Rome and Naples. It is a bequest of 1,000,000 sesterces, some $4 million, to the town of Terracina in memory of her son Maser, so that out of the income from this money, child assistance subsidies might be paid to 100.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?